Are we up for this? Are we exhausted and defeated? Or are we ready to go? Yeah. Okay, Ron Larson and I on the one hand, and Andrew Roberts on the other have been having an argument. Andrew does not like to be introduced as a brilliant speaker, and so let me say that he's a miserable speaker. I wouldn't expect much tonight. So it's hard to write a biography of Churchill for all the reasons you know. There's so much. All the greatest things that ever happened in scale are all in his life, and he was in the middle of them. And so there's been one really great biography of Winston Churchill written, and I told you last night it's 9,000 pages long. And I used to say to an incredulous Martin Gilbert, you know, not many people are going to read this. And he would say, why not? And I would say, yeah, right. Yeah. So who has written a good biography of Churchill in manageable scale? One person. A biography that can be relied on, a biography that captures the parts of it, and the parts of it are solemnity and fun, ceremony and adventure, aggressiveness and restraint, consistency and change. It's a drama. It's a huge drama. And of course, if it's spread over 9,000 pages, you can see it one way. And if it's spread over a tiny little book of only 1,000 pages, then you can see it in a different way. And I have waited my life to say, when people walk up to me and say, what should I read of Churchill? I say the same thing Richard Langworth says. I say, read my early life. And then if you get hooked, I'll tell you the next thing. If they say, what should I read about Churchill? I struggle with that. Martin Gilbert wrote one volume. It's very good. It's a rival for the best. Andrews is like it, a bit shorter and more fun. And that's such an achievement. And I will tell you, I've known him a long time, and I know that he's prepared his whole life to write this book, although I'm not sure he always knew that's what he was doing. He wrote about Halifax, Churchill's sort of friend and enemy alike. He wrote about eminent Churchillians, and that's all the people of Churchill's time and what they said about each other. And it's patterned after a classic book from the 1920s, I think, called Eminent Victorians. And if you want to understand who knew who and what they were like, and even who was sleeping with whom, they weren't always of the same surname, then he did that. And you have to dig to do that, and also not make it just phony. He's written many fine books. We're trying to remember when we met, and it was, best I can tell, sometime in the early 1990s when Doug Jeffrey got him to give a speech for where we used to work at the Claremont Institute. And when he finished his speech, I said to myself and to Penny, I said, one of these days that man is going to write a great book about Winston Churchill. Now he's done it. Andrew Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you this evening, and thank you very much indeed, Larry, for those tremendously kind words. I will always remember being introduced as a miserable speaker. Last night at dinner, Randolph Churchill said that the conclusion of the official biography, after so many years and 15.1 million words, was an achievement, a monument not unlike the building of Blenheim Palace. And a few people laughed, and I don't think they should do, because actually when you look at it, there are many civilizations that have lost their buildings, lost their architectures, lost their palaces, but their literature has survived. And that, I think, is going to be the case with Winston Churchill. So I think it was a perfectly reasonable analogy to make, in fact, that what has been concluded here this year by Hillsdale and by Larry and by Richard Langworth, without whom, by the way, I could not have written my biography of Churchill, and Soren Geiger and the rest of the team, really is a monument that will last for the ages. There are descriptions of, there's the great Napoleon created the description of Egypt back in the 19th century, and that was 21 volumes. Cambridge University brought out the Science in China volumes, 22 volumes in the 1950s. Toronto University, the Letters of Disraeli, where they ran out of money, and that was never finished. And I think, therefore, that what has been created here, this official biography, with all of its companion volumes, will be seen as the greatest publishing achievement of the 21st century. The torch was handed on by the dying Martin Gilbert to Larry, and he has now finally finished this, fulfilled this sacred task. It must fill him with a sense of powerful catharsis, which I think we noticed a sense of very much in Larry's speech yesterday. And the scientists, it's often said, are standing on the shoulders of giants. Einstein standing on the shoulders of Newton and so on. And every Churchill writer, every Churchill author and biographer is effectively standing on the shoulders of Martin Gilbert, this great figure who dedicated his life to these volumes. And now it can be said, I think, that every future Churchill historian is standing on the shoulders of Martin, but also Larry and Richard and Soren and this incredible team. And really, we cannot do enough to thank you. It is indeed now a document, as well of course of history, it's also a document for liberty and for those who love liberty, and will be used by future generations, by people who love liberty. There's a sign at the front here that says "Pursuing Truth, Defending Liberty since 1844." And as long as, of course, we can ignore the bit about 1844, which for an Englishman is yesterday, basically. The rest of it, though, is entirely true, because it is a question of pursuing truth and also of defending liberty. So there is a real sense, I think, that Hillsdale's defining mission statement is intimately bound up with the creation of this extraordinary 15.1 million word document. And for that, I think that future generations will salute you. My book, Walking with Destiny, which, by the way, with regard to the title, it's not true what a waggish friend of mine said to me the other day, that I did it in order to try to sell as many copies transatlantically, owing to the fact the Americans love destiny and British people love walking. Is an attempt to unpick, to look into this fabulous statement that Churchill made in the last paragraph of the first volume of his war memoirs, The Gathering Storm, in which he famously said that all my past life has been but a preparation for this hour and this trial. But also an attempt to look at the beginning part of that sentence where he said, I felt as if I were walking with destiny. Because Churchill's, it strikes me as it is absolutely essential in trying to understand Winston Churchill to appreciate that he had a sense of personal and private destiny, which was something that drove him on. He, of course, was only 16 years old when, as a schoolboy at Harrow School, Churchill was almost entirely self-educated because he had to be, because he went to Harrow. Not a joke I'd have made in front of Randolph Churchill yesterday, but nonetheless, it's clearly true. He said that in his life, he said this to his great friend Merland Evans, he said, in our lives, we shall see terrible upheavals, great struggles, and that I shall be called upon to save London and to save England. And all of the things that happened to him as a young man, indeed had already happened to him up until that point, served to underline this sense of private destiny, especially the extraordinary number, the remarkable number of close brushes with death that he had. He was, of course, born 2 months prematurely. That in itself in Victorian England was a close brush with death. He was stabbed in the stomach by a school friend at the age of 10, clearly not a very close friend. He, at the age of 11, nearly died of pneumonia, and on that occasion the doctors administered brandy to the 11-year-old, both orally and rectally. You might have thought that would have put you off brandy for life, but didn't in Winston Churchill's case. He very nearly died in a house fire. He very nearly died in a terrible near accident in Lake Geneva. He had 2 plane crashes which he was involved in, 3 car crashes. On the front of my book, with the wonderful picture of Joseph Karsh in 1941, you can see this huge scar down the centre of his forehead, which used to go red in meetings of the chiefs of staff of the Second World War. And that came, of course, as a result of nearly being killed on 5th Avenue and 76th Street, crossing the road. He was an Englishman, so he looked in the wrong direction as he crossed the road. And so it's a... What? Oh, sorry. Apologies. Yes, thanks very much. Okay. And those, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, are only the peacetime close brushes with death. In wartime, he took part in 5 campaigns on 4 continents. Took part, of course, in the last great cavalry charge of the British Empire at the Battle of Omdurman, where 25% of his unit, the 21st Lancers, were killed or wounded. The following year, his armoured train was ambushed by the Boers in the South African War, where 34% of his unit were killed or wounded. And then 2 months later after that, he escaped from a prisoner of war camp in South Africa and crossed 300 miles of enemy territory. And at one point he had to hide down a mine shaft, and when the candle guttered out, he could feel rats scurrying over his face. This is a man, therefore, in the First World War, of course, only 5 minutes after leaving his dugout in the front line, he insisted on going into the front line. He could have stayed back at battalion headquarters. He was Lieutenant Colonel of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He could have stayed back if he'd wanted to at battalion headquarters, but he never believed in asking his men to do anything that he wouldn't do himself. And 5 minutes after leaving a dugout in the front line, it scored a direct hit from a German whiz-bang, high explosive shell, decapitating everyone inside. And on that occasion, he said that he felt he could feel the invisible wings beating above him. He was therefore somebody who did believe in the Almighty. Although actually theologically, if you look into it carefully, the sole duty of the Almighty seems to have been to take care of Winston Churchill. And what this extraordinary sense of private destiny did for him was to give him a calmness, an extraordinary sense of calm that was to allow him to make jokes even during the great crises of the Second World War, when in confidence motions in the House of Commons. They're very rare, by the way. They seem to be cropping up a little bit more often now, but under normal circumstances, we don't have them very often. But Winston Churchill had 2 of them in 1942. And in one of them, he said that when the defects and the teething troubles of the A-22 tank became apparent to all, it was appropriately rechristened the Churchill. And the key line in that, the key word really in that gag is appropriately. Because Churchill realised that he himself had made many blunders and many mistakes in his life. He had got the Dardanelles wrong, he had got the gold standard wrong, and the abdication crisis, the black and tans, and women's suffrage and so on. But the great thing about Churchill was that he learned from his mistakes. And the way in which he learned from the Dardanelles, which, by the way, was a brilliant concept, brilliant idea, to have tried to have got the Royal Navy from the Eastern Mediterranean through the Straits of the Dardanelles and to have anchored it off Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Had it come off, it would have been one of the great strategic coups in the history of warfare, because it would have taken the Ottoman Empire out of the Great War. But it went wrong because of the implementation of it, which had nothing to do with him. He was back in London. But what he learned from the appalling defeat in the Dardanelles, because of course after the attempted breakthrough on the 18th of March 1915, 5 weeks later they then undertook a massive amphibious assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the west side of the Straits, and ultimately we lost 147,000 killed or wounded. And people still shouted, "What about the Dardanelles?" at Churchill, even into the 1930s in public meetings. But what Churchill learned from the Dardanelles was that he was never to overrule the chiefs of staff at all in the Second World War. And he was a politician who constantly learned from his mistakes. I'm often asked why I should have written a book on Churchill, considering that at the moment there are 1,009 biographies of Winston Churchill. That's what Ronald Cohen has added up. And so why on earth should one try to present a 1,010th to the public? And the answer is that since the last major biography of Churchill, there have been a extraordinary avalanche of new information about him. Her Majesty the Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries. And the King met Churchill every Tuesday of the Second World War at Buckingham Palace. And Churchill trusted the King with all of the great secrets of the Second World War. He told him about the nuclear secret, he told him about the ultra decrypts from the Enigma machines. He told him which generals and admirals were going to be hired and fired under what circumstances. He told him which countries were going to be invaded when, and so on. And the King wrote everything down. And there's no real reason why they should necessarily have got on with one another, because, of course, the King had been a supporter of Neville Chamberlain and the policy of appeasement, and Churchill had been a supporter of his elder brother, King Edward VIII, during the abdication crisis. But they did, and they did immediately. And certainly by the time of the Blitz and the Battle of Britain. And so that's a wonderful new source. In fact, Churchill was the only one of the King's 4 prime ministers who the King referred to, called by his Christian name. And he calls him his friend in these diaries. So that's a wonderful new source. Another is the diaries of Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador, 1932 to 43. And there, too, they've just come out in Moscow over the last 4 or 5 years, and those have been invaluable, as were the 41 sets of papers that have been deposited at Churchill College archives in Cambridge since the last major biography of Churchill. 41, including Mary Soames, Churchill's daughter's diaries from 1940. I was very fortunate also to be able to discover the verbatim accounts of the War Cabinet, and those which I've used and which have now been used in a Churchill biography for the first time. The Churchill family were tremendously generous in allowing me to have exclusive access to Pamela Harriman's love letters. Pamela Harriman, of course, who was Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law and who led a very active romantic life during the Second World War, I think it's fair to say, as well as, of course, being married to Randolph Churchill and having a baby by him during the Second World War. She also famously had an affair with Avril Harriman, the FDR's envoy. and Jock Whitney, and Ed Murrow, the great American journalist, and General Kenneth Anderson, and Marshal of the Air Force Sir Charles Portal, and someone we just know of as Jerry. Anyhow, the Churchill, I was very fortunate that I had exclusive access to her papers, although clearly nobody had exclusive access to her. And sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. And what it tells you, what these extraordinary this avalanche of new information, this cornucopia that has come out over the last 6-8 years or so has told you, on top of everything that we all know already from this magnificent official biography and its companion volumes, is that Churchill was not the buttoned-up Victorian aristocrat of his age and class and background. He was, in fact, an extraordinarily emotional man, a man driven by his passions. On some 50 occasions during the Second World War, Winston Churchill burst into tears in public. It would be very off-putting to see a Prime Minister burst into tears in public, apart from it happened the week before last. But it's unusual otherwise for it to happen, but people were not surprised when Churchill did it, owing to the fact that they appreciated that he was a highly eccentric and highly unusual man who was driven, as I say, by his passions. He was a throwback, effectively, to an earlier era. He was a romantic Regency figure, an aristocrat of the Regency period, a time when people wore their hearts on their sleeves. I think it's worth wondering why, and by the way, when we talk about his eccentricities, of course he was broke almost all his life. He only really got out of debt when he signed his contract for the war memoirs, his great war memoirs after the Second World War. But up until that point, there were 2 occasions when he very nearly had to sell Chartwell, his beloved, beautiful manor house in Kent that I know you've all been to. And so what he did was, of course, to write his 37 books and his over 800 articles and essays and so on. And these allow us to have an insight into his mind that is not given to very many biographers and of other people. And Churchill in the 1930s would write articles about pretty much anything. And so you get the situation that if an editor turned down an article by him, he would do what a lot of us journalists do, which is just keep the article and wait for a different editor. And so by the time of the Second World War, when, of course, any editor would publish anything that the British Prime Minister had written, he brought out a few ideas, and so you get the situation on the 7th of March 1942, a terrible time, of course, ladies and gentlemen, in the history of the Second World War. The Russian army was on the retreat through the Ukraine, British army was on the retreat through the North African littoral, Japanese had taken 1/8 of the planet, and this was the point at which the British Prime Minister published an article in the Illustrated Sunday Herald entitled, "Are There Men on the Moon?" Which concluded that there probably were men on the moon, and there were certainly such things as aliens and UFOs. Again, were Theresa May to publish an article entitled "Are There Men on the Moon" in the Sunday Times next weekend, I think people would be a little concerned. But they weren't with Churchill because they realized that this man had this extraordinary sense of eccentricity. I want to try to kill two myths that have been around for ages about him. There are so many myths. If anybody, by the way, wants to go through all of the myths about Churchill and to see the way in which they are crushed, you should read Richard Langworth's book on the myths of Winston Churchill. It is utterly superb and invaluable. But there are 2 in particular, I think, that have been around for so long now that they really do need to be nailed. The first is that he was some kind of manic depressive. The only time in his entire career that he used the phrase black dog was in July 1911 when he was writing to his wife Clementine. And at that time it was a well-known phrase used by Edwardian governesses and nannies to explain ill-tempered children. He chaired over 1,000 meetings of the War Committee, of the Defence Committee of the War Cabinet. And I simply don't believe that he was somebody who suffered from manic depression, or, as I've seen in some books, bipolar disease. Both of those diseases are debilitating illnesses, and he was able to chair these meetings until 3 o'clock in the morning. The other was that he was an alcoholic. I don't believe this either. He was somebody, clearly, who was able to deal with a tremendous amount of alcohol. He had an iron constitution for alcohol. But it was, as he said, always his servant and never his master. There's only one occasion in the whole of the 2,194 days of the Second World War that Churchill was drunk. And on that occasion, it went on till 3 o'clock in the morning. He'd been drinking whiskey, and what they did on that occasion was to hold the same meeting the next morning as though the earlier one hadn't happened. It was C.P. Scott who said of Churchill that Winston Churchill couldn't have been an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much. And of course, there's the very famous story about when, after his retirement, when he used to invite people, pretty much anyone, to come to Chartwell to see his wonderful collection of books there in his library and to see his study, and then they'd wind up in the drawing room, and at 6 o'clock he'd invite them for a drink. And he did this to 2 American Mormons, one of whom said to him that strong drink rageth and stingeth like a serpent. And Churchill replied, "I've long been looking for a drink like that." So how was it, ladies and gentlemen, how was it that this extraordinary man, this eccentric figure, this romantic figure, this passionate figure, was able to be not just the most important British politician to spot Hitler and the Nazis for what they really were, but in many ways the only major British politician in the 1930s to be able to do that? And the answer was, and by the way, not, of course, it wasn't his only act of prescience. He also, before the First World War, spotted the danger posed by Prussian militarism, and after the Second World War, that posed by Soviet communism, especially in Eastern Europe. How was it that he had this extraordinary foresight? Foresight so important, it strikes me, because these are the 3 great threats of the 20th century. He spotted them, others didn't. They were far more important than all the trivial business to do with the gold standard or the abdication crisis. The key moments he got right and others didn't. And it strikes me, ladies and gentlemen, that these things come, his prescience comes from 3 things. The first was that he was a Philosemite. He liked Jews, he'd grown up with Jews, he appreciated them, he admired their contribution to Western civilization. He'd been a Zionist at the time of the Balfour Declaration and earlier. He was somebody, therefore, who was able to place Hitler and the Nazis, to see the threat that they posed, to have an early warning system about that. And I think that's vital in order to understand the way in which he spotted what was about to happen. The second thing was that he was an historian. And one of the things that makes me proud to be an historian is that Winston Churchill was one, and he was able to place the danger in its long continuum of history, certainly of British history, of the threats, hegemonistic threats to the European balance of power. So he was able to see it in terms of Philip II of Spain and the Spanish Armada, and Louis XIV, and the great dangers shown in the War of Spanish Succession, which, of course, his own great ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, had been instrumental in defeating. And then Napoleon, and then the Kaiser, against who he himself had fought. And so he was able to see this threat in the panoply of dangers, historical dangers. And the third thing was that he was somebody who had come up against fanaticism in his life, on the northwest frontier, of course, and in the Sudan. In that case, both cases, Islamic fundamentalist fanaticism. But he saw the same tropes in the political fanaticism of the Nazis, in a way that the other prime ministers of the 1930s, men like Stanley Baldwin and Ramsay MacDonald and Neville Chamberlain, were not able to do. And so you have, therefore, somebody who has the foresight. He also has the extraordinary moral courage that goes with his physical courage. It's as great as his physical courage. He was somebody who didn't employ speechwriters ever, who didn't employ spin doctors, who didn't take notice of opinion polls. There's a marvellous moment in the Second World War when he was told that that politicians should keep their ears to the ground. And he said that he didn't believe that people would respect politicians who were caught in so ungainly a posture. And so you knew what you got from Winston Churchill was something that came straight from him. But none of this, ladies and gentlemen, would have mattered. None of this would have worked unless he had also had eloquence, extraordinary rhetorical ability, the capacity to make people listen to him, to persuade them, to urge them to listen to him because of the quality of his rhetoric and his oratory. He was once asked by Jock Colville, his private secretary, what were the tricks of the trade? What were the techniques that he used in order to enthuse the nation and the civilized world in 1940 to 41? And those great wartime speeches, morale-boosting speeches. And he said, really, it came down to three things. The first was to keep your sentences short. Each sentence should have one thought and one thought only that it's attempting to get over. Don't bother with all the subclauses and so on. The second was to keep your words short. Don't show off by using long words. Use the short words, the ones that actually are right for the sentence. And the third was, if at all possible, to use words that the English-speaking peoples use in their own common parlance and have done for 1,000 years, words that can be found in Anglo-Saxon and Old English. And so when you look at the great peroration, the last paragraph of the We Shall Fight on the Beaches speech of 4th of June 1940, where he is telling the British people what they are going to do when the Germans landed in southern England. And you look at where he said, of course, we shall fight on the beaches and on the landing grounds, in the streets and in the hills, fight with ever-growing confidence in the air, ending, of course, with that line, we shall never surrender. When you look at the 141 words of that peroration, that last paragraph, all but two of them come from Old English. The only two exceptions being confidence, which comes from the Latin, and surrender, which comes from the French. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, you have asked an Englishman here to speak. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, man who makes mistakes, terrible blunders on occasion, but learns from them. Somebody who has a moral courage equal to his physical courage. Somebody who has tremendous foresight, extraordinary foresight, driven very largely by his sense of history. And somebody who has the eloquence to ask people to listen to him even though they don't agree with him and they don't want to hear what he has to say, the warnings that he has to give, the detailed warnings before the Second World War about the importance of high defense spending, especially in the air. And you put all of these things together, and you have somebody who is capable of going even beyond what he had predicted for himself as a 16-year-old schoolboy, because he wasn't just able to save London and to save England, but actually he saved civilization itself. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. That's so kind of you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got some time for questions and answers.
So you're going to have to shout, and we won't do it for long because you need to go to bed. You look tired. but Andrew's agreed to do this, and it's a great opportunity. Who would like to ask a question or say something?
Well, I'll kick it off. I first read one of the biographies of Martin
If you could get me some red wine.
About, I don't know, 20. And I remember being astonished that this young man was all fighting the Boers when I was thinking about which sundress to wear to some fraternity. So, was it the man that was made by the history that he was a part of, or was it the history that made the man?
Oh, very good question, Melissa. I think that it's very important to remember when we think about his very early drive, to remember his parentage and his background. His father, of course, Lord Randolph Churchill, was Chancellor of the Exchequer in a Conservative government and had been the man who had annexed Burma to the Crown in 1886. And his mother, Jenny Jerome, an American, had an important influence on him as well. She didn't actually take much notice of him early on in his life. Oh, well done, thank you. He actually, for the first 6 months of 1884, when he was 9 years old, she only saw him for 6.5 hours in those 6 months. And what he did instead of that was to be interested in history, especially British history, was to be interested in military history, and he really reckoned that the way that he was going to be able to continue his father's political legacy was to get into the House of Commons early. They had no money, and so the way he was going to do that was to join the army and show tremendous courage on the field of battle, which is what he did on 5 occasions on 4 continents. And so he was somebody who had this tremendous sense of destiny, and I think, to answer you, he always believed that he was going to impose himself on history. He was not somebody who fell for a moment for the Whig or determinist or Marxist sense of history where the individual doesn't matter and everything about history is just driven by dark impersonal forces, as T.S. Eliot called them. He had a great man view of history, in which individuals really can stamp their personalities on the age, and he intended from a very young and early age to be one of those personalities. Gentleman now.
Yes, you said after his experience in the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli, he learned not to disagree with his chiefs of staff.
No. He disagreed with them all the time, not to overrule them. He had great clashes with them.
So I wanted to ask you to expand on that.
Yes, that's a good question. No, he was constantly disagreeing with them. But what he didn't do was, when all 3 of them agreed on something, he did not use his constitutional powers as Minister of Defence and, of course, as Prime Minister to overrule them. He would argue with them, he would debate with them, he would bring in his own statistical office, he would use decrypts from the Ultra, boffins at Bletchley Park. He would shout sometimes, he would bang the table, he would on occasionally burst into tears, he would do anything to try and get them to change their minds. But if he failed, and very often he did fail, because he was up against the 6'4" flinty Ulsterman, General Sir Alan Brooke, later Field Marshal Lord Alan Brooke, who was an extremely tough-minded man, who would sit across the cabinet table from Churchill, breaking pencils in half, saying, "No, I disagree with you, Prime Minister." And so the thing that he learned was that even if he wanted an invasion of northern Norway or northern Sumatra, as he did on 2 occasions in the Second World War, he was not going to impose his will against the collected will of the chiefs of staff, which makes actually the Western way, the democratic way of fighting wars, so much more superior, because you also get, of course, a disagreement between Franklin Roosevelt and George C. Marshall about grand strategy as well, and so much superior. And those had to be fought out and argued in gentlemanly but tough arguments. So much superior to what was going on 1,800 miles behind the Russian-German front in the Wolfschanze, where the Führer would listen to his generals, people who had far better experience of warfare and of staff college than ever he had. Men like Erich Manstein and Gerd Rundstedt and Heinz Guderian and so on, Erwin Rommel, of course, and he'd listen to them for up to an hour, and then go back to doing precisely what he'd originally intended to do at the beginning of the meeting. So, and you see very much also with Stalin, the way in which Stalin at the beginning acted as you'd expect a totalitarian dictator to act. And actually, after Operation Barbarossa and the great German invasion of Russia, he fairly quickly adopted the much more collegiate approach, where he would listen to marshals like Konev or Zhukov or Rokossovsky, and would allow his mind to be changed by them. Sorry.
Jeff, you want 2 more? Okay, Adrian and Jeff.
So I'm wondering if you might comment on the personal side of it. So we know he had a difficult relationship with his parents, maybe not the ideal childhood. Having been to Chartwell, it seemed like he had a great love for his children and for his wife. Could you give us a little more insight into his family?
Yes, his father, as I mentioned, was a very serious and significant politician. But he was a disdainful. He was a brilliant politician in many ways and a great speaker. But he was a disdainful man who wrote letters that no father should ever write to any son, full of contempt. And instead of allowing this to affect him, in fact, Winston Churchill, he did the opposite. And when his father died at the age of 45 in 1895, when Churchill was 20, he sought out his father's friends to talk to them about his father. He wrote a 1,000-page 2-volume biography of his father. He adopted his father's political stance, the Tory democracy stance of Benjamin Disraeli. He adopted his father's speaking stance. He quoted him endlessly in speeches. He called his own son Randolph. And then in 1947, he had a very weird moment where he believed that he had met his father's ghost. And actually, you can read the entire story in a book called The Dream, which was edited brilliantly, again, by Richard Langworth, and I do recommend it, because it's a very interesting sort of psychodrama between the son and the father, because at no point during this long conversation they had did he tell his father that he had been instrumental in helping win the Second World War. And so you have this at the same time as his mother, who, as I mentioned earlier, saw very little of him, and indeed really didn't show him terribly much interest until he became a signatory on her trust fund. At which point she did show some interest in him. But also, he didn't allow that to affect his love for his mother. And in my early life, which Larry is so right saying is it's the first port of call for anybody interested in Churchill, and you should really read it just before you read mine. He said of his mother, Jenny Jerome, "She shone for me like the evening star, brilliant but at a distance." And so you can very much see the drives in the man from the parents. Was there another question? John O'Sullivan there. And I'm going to finish, by the way, with a couple of Churchill gags, if that's all right. Won't be long, I promise.
Andrew, if you stand back from the 20th century and you see, as I think you do, Churchill as the angel of light in that century, who was the angel of darkness? And who do you think Churchill thought was the angel?
I think, well, obviously Hitler, but also Churchill very much saw Lenin and Trotsky as being driving agents of darkness. Trotsky in particular, he had a animus for, and one of the things that's slightly problematical about Churchill is that he did personally get on with Stalin. One sort of hopes that he wouldn't, but in a sense he had to. Because when one looks just at the sheer statistics of the Second World War and realises that for every 5 Germans killed in combat, by which I mean soldiers killed on a battlefield as opposed to Germans being killed by the combined bomber offensive from the air, killed in combat, for every 5 of them, 4 died on the Eastern Front. And so we, the Americans, British, Canadians and so on, were killing the 5th German, to all intents and purposes. So of course the British Prime Minister needed to get on with Stalin. But as soon as he could break free, at his great speech in Fulton, Missouri on the 5th of March 1946, the Iron Curtain speech, he did denounce Stalin. So I think, yes, those are the sort of troika of monsters. Now, I know you need to all get to bed. However, I'm going to tell you 2 Churchill anecdotes, just simply because they amuse me at the moment. In this book, there are about 200 of Churchill's jokes, but so my favourite ones change constantly. But there are 2 that I particularly love. One, which, in his killjoy way, Richard will tell me Churchill probably didn't say, but nonetheless, it just sort of sounds so much like him that you really hope that he did. And that is the time that he met Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister, but at that time German ambassador to London, who threatened him at a reception and said that in the next war, Italy will be on the side of the Third Reich. And Churchill replied, "Well, it seems only fair. We had to have them last time." And don't shake your head, Richard. Please. I think I'm going down in his estimation now, even having told that joke. It's just too good not to. But finally, one that we know he did say, which was when his private secretary, Jock Colville, who I mentioned earlier, told him that their cook had been made pregnant as the result of a nocturnal assignation with a man in the street in Verona. And Churchill replied, "Obviously not one of the 2 gentlemen." Thank you very much indeed.